Scaphism. Scaphism involves a person being force-fed milk and honey past their normal limits. This goes on until the victim swells like a balloon. But weight gain is the least of the victim's worries here because it only gets much worse than that. The victim is tied to 2 boats, covered with more milk and honey, and taken to a swampy area with countless insects looking for their next meal. The smell of milk and honey made these hungry swamp creatures look at the victim as a buffet table. The victim is left for days as bugs and creatures eat through their skin and flesh. But it gets darker than that because the executioners return to force feed them more milk and honey in what is a drawn-out punishment. Rinse and repeat for a few hours, and we have a victim who's basically being eaten alive by insects and rotting from infection. The rack. The majority of the time, punishment wasn't always about killing someone outright in ancient and medieval times, but rather getting confessions out of criminals. And the rack was the go-to device for anyone in feudal England who was suspected of anything, from heresy, witchcraft, or even just being Catholic. The scene involves a rectangular wooden frame with rollers at the ends. The person being punished has their ankles and wrists tied to these rollers, then someone operates a crank that tightens the ropes attached to the rollers, stretching the victim's body. It's like a tug of war, but with the bones and joints being stretched out as far as possible. As the ropes tighten, the victim experiences intense pain as their body is stretched beyond its natural limits. It's excruciating, but not necessarily lethal. It's just enough to coerce any confession out of them, even if it wasn't true, as the victims would obviously want the pain to end. However, even if someone confesses, their punishment isn't over. The rack can leave them with disfigured limbs and bones, especially if they don't confess quickly enough. So while it may not kill you outright, it indeed ensures a lifetime of suffering for those subjected to it. Flaying. Flaying is one of the oldest forms of punishment in mankind's history because there are documented cases from ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. The punishment involves someone's skin getting removed, similar to how animals are skinned before they're cooked. But instead of killing the person before skinning them, flaying involves removing their skin while they are still alive. Of course, the agony doesn't even start there because the victims are boiled before they are flayed to make their skin and flesh softer. It's a pretty brutal scene that's meant to maximize pain. The executioners use sharp knives to steadily work their way through the person's skin, causing immense pain to the victim. People undergoing flaying usually die from shock because of the unbearable pain, but they can also die from infections as well because their flesh is exposed. While it was mainly a method of execution, it was also a way to scare other people from doing the same thing because the flayed victim, dead or alive, is usually hung in a public area where the locals can see what can potentially happen to them if they were brave enough to cross the line. Maiming. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest sets of laws, is well known for its famous phrase, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." But this wasn't just a saying at the time, it was taken very literally. During those times, punishment often meant physical harm or bodily injury, and it was all about making the punishment fit the crime. So if someone gouged out another person's eye, they'd lose their eye in return. If someone were caught stealing, they'd lose their hands, the tools they used for thievery. And yes, if someone committed a sexual assault, you can guess what part of their anatomy might be at risk. Sometimes maiming became a brutal method of punishment that had nothing to do with the specific crime committed. It turned into a gruesome form of torture where authorities would systematically chop off body parts until the victim confessed to whatever they were accused of. It was a brutal system where the severity of the punishment often matched the severity of the crime and sometimes even went beyond it. The Brazen Bowl. In 570 BC in ancient Greece, a craftsman was hired by Pherylus, a cruel ruler who wanted a unique way of punishing criminals. And perhaps to give you an idea of what kind of man he was, he said this about them being tortured in the Brazen Bowl. "His screams will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most pathetic, most melodious of bellowings." Paralaus came up with a bronze device shaped like a bowl. The Brazen Bowl looked like any old metal cow, but became one of that era's darkest creations. When they wanted to execute someone, they stuffed that person into the bowl and lit a fire underneath. This means that this metal bowl wasn't made to cook a steak dinner, but to cook people instead. The flames under the bronze contraption would heat the entire bowl up, causing the person inside to cook steadily and slowly while they're screaming in agony. But the Brazen Bowl wasn't just to execute people, because Pherylus also wanted it to be entertaining. The bowl was rigged using a system of pipes that made the gadget sound like a real bowl whenever the person inside was screaming for their life. Impalement. Impalement involves a long wooden stake planted firmly on the ground. Meanwhile, a person accused of a crime is forced onto this stake, which slowly enters through the victim's butthole. Gravity takes over as the victim's weight pushes them down while the stake makes its way through their insides. It causes the worst pain imaginable, and the worst part is that it is a slow and painful death that doesn't immediately kill a person until the wooden stake goes through their vital organs or forces the victim to bleed to death. The stake usually exits through the mouth or the chest, turning the victim into a human kebab, but by that time, the victim would already be long dead. The bodies of the victims are usually laid across the field to instill fear into anyone who dares to cross the authorities or break the law. Breaking wheel. The breaking wheel has spokes with the victim's body tied to it. Meanwhile, the executioners spin the wheel while another guy smashes the victim with a large hammer, all in front of a crowd. But the point of this punishment was not to kill the victim right off the bat, but to make them suffer. The first phase of breaking the wheel focuses more on breaking the victim's limbs, but the executioners take it to a new level in the second phase by lighting a fire under the wheel, burning the victim as they spin, all while the executioner keeps whacking them with a hammer. There were cases when the executioner finished the job in the second phase by bashing the victim's skull, but there are times when the person is left beaten and broken for days, being left to endure harsh weather conditions and hungry animals, or hoisted on top as a warning to others. Ling Qi. Known as death by 1,000 cuts, Ling Qi dates back to China's Qing dynasty when it was reserved only for the worst crimes, such as murder and treason. The punishment involved using sharp blades to cut parts of the body methodically. The cuts themselves weren't meant to kill because they were just minor flesh wounds, but when numbered in the hundreds or even the thousands, these wounds can cause immense pain. There were cases where the executions would make the experience worse by throwing dirty water onto the victim to infect their wounds. If the victim doesn't die from wounds, they can bleed to death. But there were instances where the victims would die from shock. China took hundreds of years to abolish the practice, officially outlawing it in 1905. Out of more than 1,000 people subjected to this punishment, the record books say that around 70 of them were put to death. Stoning. Stoning, also called lapidation, was a brutal method of capital punishment. It's a straightforward way of sentencing someone to death without complicated machinery or methods. All it required were stones. The punishment involves people hurling stones at someone until they succumb to the injuries. These stones aren't massive enough to instantly kill or inflict significant harm, but they inflict enough pain to lead to death eventually. The victim has to endure a barrage of stones until shock or blunt force trauma takes their life. But what makes it worse is that it is done in front of the public, humiliating the victim before killing them. Stoning was often reserved for severe offenses like adultery or blasphemy. Locals would usually carry out the punishment, believing that the community should have a say in matters of morality and justice. Rat torture. Rats are natural scavengers with a knack for escaping tricky situations. Medieval torturers used this to their advantage by devising rat torture as a gruesome method of punishment for criminals. Rat torture involves placing a metal cage of rats on the victim's belly. From there, the torturers apply fire to the cage, gradually heating it. Naturally, the rats will be compelled to try to escape as the cage becomes hot enough to cook them. Unfortunately for the victim, the softest target happens to be their belly. The rats chewed their way through the victim's belly to escape being cooked alive. It's already painful enough for rodents to bite and claw through skin and flesh, but the pain reaches new heights when the rats chew their way through organs to create an exit through the person's body. Iron Maiden. At first glance, the Iron Maiden looks like a harmless metal coffin designed to have a woman's face. But nobody wants to end up inside this maiden. From the outside, it just looked like any old box. But inside, it was lined with spikes, turning it into something straight out of your worst nightmares. Getting squeezed by this thing was like being hugged by a cactus from all angles. Once someone was locked inside, they were left to scream in agony as those spikes slowly pierced through their skin and flesh. And here's the messed up part, the spikes were strategically placed to avoid vital organs, ensuring the victim's suffering was prolonged. prolonged. Whoever came up with this had to have a seriously twisted mind and a disturbingly detailed knowledge of human anatomy. There are tales of Iron Maiden gadgets from the 19th century, but whether they were widely used in medieval times is still being determined. Some say it's just a myth, as little solid evidence supports their widespread use. But either way, it's a chilling reminder of how dark history can be. Branding. Animals weren't the only things branded during the medieval period. It's got a pretty grim history involving people. Centuries ago, authorities would sear a hot iron onto their skin instead of slapping fines or jail time on wrongdoers. But the pain wasn't even the worst part. See, once branded, you were marked for life. It wasn't about killing you, instead it was about humiliating you forever. Imagine having this visible mark, broadcasting to everyone that you messed up. It was like a social death. You couldn't make friends or form relationships because nobody wanted to be associated with a branded criminal. Branding wasn't for minor stuff either, because it was reserved for serious crimes like forgery, theft, or adultery. And living as a branded outcast forever might have been even worse than death. Cement shoes. You might have heard about cement shoes from when mobsters ruled the streets, from the saying, sleeping with the fishes, where you literally are made to go to sleep with the fish at the bottom of the sea or lake. Surprisingly, they weren't just about punishment. Instead, they were more of a method of making someone vanish without a trace. The punishment involves filling a pair of shoes with wet concrete and forcing the victim to wear them. Then they toss them into a body of water. As the concrete sets, it essentially turns the victim into a permanent fixture on the ocean floor. Tongue terror. Primarily used during the days of the Roman Empire, the tongue terror was unlike most torture methods. Instead of forcing victims to admit their crimes, this method was meant to silence people with opinions different from what was normal at the time. The world is actually a globe and not flat? That's a tongue tearing. We don't have to send thousands of men to their deaths in war. That is especially a tongue tearing. It was a twisted way to control the masses, silencing them through fear or using the literal method. The tongue terror was a pair of pliers with jagged edges. It didn't look too dangerous, but how it was used made people fear it. Authorities had to tie down their victims and force their mouths open to use the tongue terror. From there, they used this device to clamp it down on the victim's tongue, twisting and pulling it out of the victim's mouth. It wasn't only about dishing out immense pain and suffering and keeping people silent, especially when there were many opinions about an unpopular leader. While the Romans mostly used it, it became one of the most common torture methods used by different cultures throughout history, due to how simple yet effective it was. Judas Cradle. The Spanish Inquisition, a group meant to combat heresy in Spain, was creative enough in its methods to sort out people with different religious beliefs, but the Inquisitors were more creative at torturing heretics, using the Judas Cradle to extract confessions and information from prisoners. The Judas Cradle was too simple for anyone to think of, but creative enough in its application. It was a pointed seat shaped like a pyramid. Victims were hoisted and lowered as the pyramid's tip aimed to enter the bottom hole. It was a slow torture that allowed the Judas Cradle's tip to stretch everything out as the rest of the pyramid gradually entered the anus, causing the worst kind of pain imaginable. Torturers would even try to speed the process by adding weights to the victim. Adding insult to injury, the Judas Cradle could cause infections because it was left uncleaned every time it was used. And even if the victim makes it out alive after a confession, let's just say that things down there would never be the same again. The rack. The rack is a medieval torture method disguised as a visit to your physical therapist. This device was a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's ankles and wrists are tied to these rollers as the torturers start turning the crank to allow the rollers to pull the victim in opposite directions. It may initially provide relief by cracking those aching joints, but the rack eventually pulls your body beyond its normal limits. The rack stretches the victim like a chef stretches pizza dough, pulling those bones out of place slowly yet steadily. Victims often confess to pretty much anything, regardless of whether or not they're guilty, to make the agony stop. But even if the victim does survive the rack, it leaves them disfigured and with broken bodies and spirits. Let's just say a trip to the rack isn't the best way to stretch those stiff muscles and joints out. Garrote. As one of the most efficient torture devices in humanity's dark past, twist. The garrote is a contraption designed for strangulation instead of creating a bloody mess that torturers need to clean up after. The garrote is a chair-like machine that consists of a metal collar with a screw mechanism. It works by forcing the victim to sit on the chair as the metal collar is wrapped around their neck. As the screw tightens, the collar applies pressure to the neck, blocking veins and arteries in the neck and causing strangulation. Its purpose was straightforward, in the sense that it worked by squeezing the life out of its victim in a slow but painful manner. Victims would have to bear the pain of their airways getting crushed. In the worst-case scenario, the pressure from the collar would be enough to snap the spine. The terrifying part about the garrote was its comparatively compact form and relatively cleaner method of torturing and killing. Torturers didn't have to bring large machines that may have been effective, but were heavier and bloodier to use. On the other hand, the garrote got the job done efficiently, making it the preferred torture and execution method by many European nations, including Spain, which continued to use the garrote until 1959. Saw torture. Saw torture is the perfect blend of psychological and physical torture. It starts with a person tied down to a table or a platform. Meanwhile, a massive saw blade hangs above the victim. The saw slowly lowers down toward the person, inch by inch, causing psychological pain to the victim, anticipating the pain that they're about to feel. The feeling of seeing a giant blade steadily making its way down is psychological torture at its finest. Every second feels like an eternity for the victim, who knows that the saw is going to mess them up badly once it reaches them. And as you can expect, the idea of an impending painful death is usually enough to get a confession out of anyone. There are times, however, when the saw torture was only meant to be psychological, because the saw blade stopped just short of cutting the victim, especially if the person had already confessed to their crimes. But if the blade does indeed make its way down to the person, it doesn't take much to inflict maximum physical damage or even instant death, as the saw cuts through skin, flesh, and organs. Scaphism. Allegedly used in ancient Persia, scaphism starts with the victim getting force-fed milk and honey. But it's not just a few cups of this sweet stuff. Instead, the torturers keep on shoving milk and honey down the person's throat until they're about to burst. It doesn't get any better, because the victim is tied to 2 boats and is bathed in more milk and honey. From there, the boat is sent to a swamp, where the victim is left out in the hot sun while bugs and other creepy crawlies make their way to the sweet scent of sugar. They start munching on the victim's skin and flesh, but they're not there to get a quick bite. Instead, they stay as long as possible, feasting on the person who feels every agonizing bite from hundreds or thousands of bugs. It can get worse when nature calls and the victim is forced to pee and defecate on the spot, causing more insects and other critters to make their way to the buffet table. It's a nightmarish scene that's meant to drag on for as long as possible, until the torturers get what they want or the person dies. Necklacing. Rumored to have been used during the apartheid era of South Africa, necklacing was a form of torture that was meant to intimidate individuals or exert power over other people by instilling fear into a community. Necklacing works by wrapping a rubber tire soaked in gasoline around a person's neck and arms. The tire is set on fire, burning the person wearing this twisted necklace as it melts the victim's flesh while suffocating them. This method of torture made sure to maximize the victim's pain, as they can't do anything while the heat from the tire burns through their flesh, all while they can't scream in pain because they struggle to breathe while trapped in the flames. Necklacing, however, was also a form of public execution. It was meant to torture its victims to death while also torturing the public, dealing psychological scars to different communities to make them fall in line and obey oppressive authority figures. Bamboo torture. Although there are no concrete accounts that it was ever used, bamboo torture is the perfect example of torturers being some of the most resourceful people around, because it involves nothing but the brutality of nature. In bamboo torture, the victim is tied up over a patch of bamboo shoots. It seems harmless initially, but bamboo shoots are sharp and can grow faster than most plants. Bamboo is as tough as nails and can pierce through skin and flesh. So as time passes by, the bamboo shoots grow and pierce through the victim's skin. But the impalement isn't quick. Bamboo may grow fast, but it doesn't grow in an instant. The victim could suffer for hours or even days as bamboo slowly grows and penetrates deeper into their flesh, causing severe pain. The torture was meant to be slow and agonizing, paralyzing. Its victims could die from shock or by bleeding out. Those are the lucky ones, because some may have survived long enough for the bamboo to make its way through the victim's body. Waterboarding. When the CIA isn't overthrowing suspected communist governments, then it's probably spending its time at black sites like Guantanamo Bay, waterboarding prisoners. It may sound like a trip to the beach, but trust us when we say that waterboarding is nothing but a twisted way of teaching you how to hold your breath underwater. Waterboarding involves torturers strapping you down on your back while covering your face with a cloth. From there, water is poured over the cloth, making you feel like you're drowning. It's a cruel way of making your brain think that you're underwater, even though you're not. The sensation puts your body in a fight or flight situation, like drowning underwater. Every part of your body is telling you that you have to swim to safety or do anything to save your life. But the worst part is that you can't do anything because you're tied down on a table. You can't even swim to safety because you're not even in the water. This torture takes a toll on your body, but it's more of a psychological horror experience that messes with your brain and makes you feel powerless while your mind thinks that you're drowning. It's not even meant to kill, but to force a confession out of the victim, simply. Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish is aptly named because it's a pear-shaped device with a literal twist that can cause extreme agony. This metal pear is shoved in one of your openings. In most cases, it's the mouth. However, it could be worse when the torturers decide to take it to the next level by shoving it into your anus. If that sensation isn't bad enough, they twist the pear, causing it to expand. As the metal pear-shaped object opens, it stretches whatever opening it was jammed into. It gets bigger and bigger inside you, causing immense pain, especially if it gets shoved in your behind. But the device wasn't just about inflicting physical pain. Instead, it was meant to humiliate the victim, setting an example to other people who don't want a metal contraption getting stuffed in the worst possible hole imaginable. Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey is not a fun ride at all, but is a cruel torture device designed by the Spanish Inquisition in their efforts to weed out the heretics from the public. This device is a wooden prism that's meant for the victims to sit on. However, the victim is placed in such a way that the point of the prism is in direct contact with the crotch, or genitals, causing pain and discomfort. It doesn't stop there because as the torture progresses, weights are placed on the victim's legs to increase the Spanish donkey's pressure on the sensitive parts. The point of the torture was to inflict as much pain as possible. Look back to the times when you accidentally got your crotch hit, but magnify the pain times 10 and prolong it to minutes or even hours. That's what the Spanish donkey feels like. Of course, the point of the Spanish donkey was not to kill, but to force information out of people suspected of heresy by the Spanish Inquisition. Brazen bowl. The brazen bowl was an ancient Greek device that a mad ruler ordered to be crafted to torture and even execute criminals. This device was specifically made to look like a bronze bowl, but it held a dark secret. The brazen bowl had an opening used to stuff people inside the metal contraption. After that, a fire would be lit under the bowl to roast whoever was inside. But instead of roast beef, you get a man roasted alive as the victim screams in pain and agony. But the worst part of it all is that the brazen bowl was designed in such a way that it had a system of tubes that caused the victim's screams to sound like the bellowing of a bull. So as the brazen bowl cooks the screaming victim inside, it creates a horrific sound that's music to the ears of a twisted man. It's torture to the public as well, especially when they know that the bowl's bellowing is the screaming of a man who can't do anything while he's getting cooked alive. Breaking wheel. The breaking wheel is a torture device that was the medieval version of whack-a-mole on the part of the torturer. It involved tying the victim onto a spinning wheel. That's when the sinister fun starts for a man wielding the hammer. As the victim is spinning on the device, the torturer starts smashing their limbs with a hammer, cracking every bone in the person's body until they're nothing but dust. But that's just the first phase of the breaking wheel. The second phase may involve lighting a fire under the wheel, doubling the pain. So as the victim is spinning and getting their arms and legs smashed, they're getting roasted alive. Let's not even forget about the touch of dizziness and disorientation that makes everything worse. If that wasn't brutal enough, the torturer may leave the victim on the wheel for the crows and animals to feast on. But if the victim manages to survive a day out in the open, that's when the torturer turns into the executioner by breaking their neck or crushing their chest with the hammer, ending the person's suffering once and for all. The Spanish spider. Suppose you had radical ideas about religion during medieval times. In that case, you'd wish you weren't living in Spain, because the Spanish Inquisition was known for having some of the most creatively brutal brutal execution methods at that time. Included among those were the Spanish spider. Also known as the strapado, the Spanish spider was a form of hanging with a few extra steps that made it much more painful. You'll be hoisted up by your arms with your hands tied behind your back. This means your entire body weight pulls you on your shoulders and joints, causing severe pain. The strapado was meant to prolong the agony instead of simply dropping you and breaking your neck. As you're up there dangling, your weight slowly dislocates your limbs out of your sockets while tearing every muscle up there. You won't be able to help but scream for mercy. But the Spanish Inquisition won't stop there, because they're going to add weights to your ankles, causing your body to stretch well beyond normal proportions, making you look like a disfigured medieval version of Mr. Fantastic. It goes without saying that this device was eventually going to kill you, especially if your arms get ripped out of your body. If not, the pain you'd have to endure the entire time would be more than enough to kill you, as your body won't be able to handle more pain. It was the Spanish Inquisition's way of telling people to never get on the wrong side of the church. Execution by elephant. Today, you'll surely think that elephants are gentle and intelligent giants who deserve all the love and care in the world. But people in the medieval era, particularly in Asia, the southern parts of Europe, and Africa, used these creatures as the ultimate instruments of justice. Of course, we know that elephants are incredibly large, making them useful beasts of burden for many different medieval cultures hundreds of years ago. But these majestic giants were also smart enough to be trained to execute criminals in many different ways. These elephants usually had a handler responsible for giving them orders on how to deal with certain criminals. The simplest way to execute you using an elephant was to allow the weight of this massive beast to crush you into mush. If the authorities wanted you to suffer, they would have the elephant crush your limbs methodically. However, there were also cases where you'd be tied to two elephants going the opposite direction so that they'd tear you into two. The worst part was that executions by elephants were public spectacles. Think of it as your modern-day circus, where elephants are trained to do various tricks, but instead of doing stunts, these medieval elephants were trained to kill for the sake of entertainment and to ensure that no one would try to defy the law. After all, no one wanted to get flattened by an elephant. Drawing and quartering. You would know that you committed only the worst crimes imaginable if you were condemned to die through drawing and quartering, an execution method that could have come from the most sadistic medieval mind. The brutal nature of drawing and quartering was reserved for crimes like treason or rebellion, as it was the authorities' way of sending a statement to all the other rebels in the country. The drawing part comes when you get tied to a wooden frame and dragged by a horse to the execution site. Your body would be injured when you get to the site, especially if the ride was too rough. Once at the execution site, you'll be forced to face the real horror. They'd hang you by the neck, but cut you down before you die because they just want you to suffer. From there, they would disembowel you, cutting your belly open to remove some of your guts and maybe even your heart. You'd likely die in that stage, but others are unlucky enough to stay alive for the final stage, which is the quartering. Here, your limbs would be tied to horses going in opposite directions as they will tear your body apart. Keel hauling. When you think of the pirates during the Middle Ages, it's hard not to think about them sailing the high seas, pillaging ships, and going from one port to another to drink until they drop. But even the pirates had their own way of dealing with criminals or mutineers. If you thought that being a pirate was all about adventures, just make sure that you don't piss the captain off or commit a major offense that's against the pirate code. That's because pirates won't leave you with a simple slap on the wrist. Instead, you're going to have to go through something called keel hauling. What happens here is that you'd be tied to a rope that runs underneath the ship from one side to the other. Pirates would then throw you overboard, allowing you to get dragged along the ship's underside. That's why it's called keel hauling, as you'll be hauled along the keel, the main structure at the bottom of the ship. As you're getting dragged under the ship, that's when you'll realize that maybe the pirate's life isn't for you. The sharp barnacles along the ship's hull will slice through your skin and flesh as if you're submerged in a giant cheese grater. There's also a good chance that you're going to drown, especially if the captain wants to leave you there to die. The unlucky ones that survive usually have so many wounds and scratches on their body and faces, making them so ugly even their own mother wouldn't wouldn't recognize them. Pressing. Let's say you committed a crime in medieval Europe and you were condemned to pressing. At first, the word pressing doesn't sound too bad, but you heard that in French, it's called peine forte et dure, which translates to strong and harsh punishment. That's when you know you are in for the worst time of your life. Pressing often happens during a trial, especially when you are forced to plead guilty. If you don't want to admit guilt, that's when pressing happens, to compel you to tell everyone that you're guilty. In pressing, a wooden board is placed on top of you as you lay on the ground. Then heavy stones or weights are gradually added to the board until the weight becomes so unbearable that you're forced to plead guilty or die. The increasing pressure would slowly crush your chest, making it harder for you to breathe while you're in so much pain. Sometimes the victim could survive for days, especially if they have strong muscles and bones. However, the crushing weight would eventually be too much, as it could lead to internal injuries or suffocation. Essentially, the authorities are in a win-win situation here because they want to force you to admit your guilt or kill you. Either way, you die, because admitting your guilt would also condemn you to another execution method, the heretic's fork. The Spanish Inquisition likely had an entire room full of torture and execution devices meant for heretics and any person who defied the church. So if you offended the church with your not-so-Christian ideas, the Spanish Inquisition's going to have its way with you using a wide method of execution devices, including the heretic's fork. The heretic's fork looked like an accessory because it was meant to be worn around your neck, but the difference is that wearing it had deadly consequences. It had two sets of fork-like prongs. One was positioned under the chin, while the other pressed against the chest. Basically, when you were made to wear the heretic's fork, you'll be forced to keep your head up high. If you moved your head, or even did something as simple as speaking, the forks would dig through your neck and chest, causing immense pain before killing you. Even if you had all the discipline in the world to avoid moving your head, the heretic's fork made resting or sleeping impossible, because that would mean allowing the prongs to pierce through your skin and flesh. As such, those who were made to wear this device would either confess their crimes or succumb to their exhaustion before allowing the forks on their neck and chest to kill them, boiling alive. One day, you're chilling in prison after you were found guilty of a serious crime, such as treason or poisoning, but you suddenly see a few guys taking out a huge cauldron and boiling water over a huge fire. You suddenly think, maybe they're cooking my last meal, but it turns out that you're the one who will get cooked. It's as simple as it sounds. You will get immersed in a pot full of water and oil. At first, the liquid would be cold, or at the very least warm, but as the temperature increases, you're going to be in a lot of pain as your skin is slowly burned. Sometimes the condemned would be thrown into a pot with the liquid already boiling. The shock and pain were immediate, but it was as effective as slowly increasing the temperature. The point here is that you're going to get tortured as the organs inside of your body are slowly being cooked while you're conscious and screaming at the top of your lungs for mercy. Soon enough, you'll be ready to be served to dogs or lions as a meal. However, luckily you won't be alive for the second part since you die at some point while being cooked. Gibbeting. Suppose that you were a criminal in Europe during the 16th century. You just found out that you were condemned to death after committing a heinous crime, such as piracy. Of course, you'd think they'd use the tried and tested execution method of hanging you. Instead, you see the executioners dragging a large cage as you suddenly realize that you're about to face a fate worse than death. Gibbeting was unlike your usual execution method in that no one directly executes you. Instead, you'd simply be left hanging in an iron cage in a public place as if you're an oversized bird. At first, you'd think that this doesn't sound too bad, but then you realize that you'll be left there your entire life, without any food and water, all while people all over the town can see you in the sorriest state of your life. Once you're hoisted up in that cage, it's game over for you, because you'd be left to linger there until you die. You spent weeks exposed to the heat of the sun or the freezing temperatures of winter. As your body grows weaker, you'd be telling everyone passing by to put you out of your misery. Eventually, you'll die due to sheer exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Gibbeting was one of the most popular execution methods throughout Europe during the medieval ages, and even until the earlier part of the modern period. It served as a way to both humiliate and execute murderers, and some of the worst criminals, and the prolonged nature of this execution is the reason why most criminals would rather have their heads chopped off instead. Buried alive. No, this isn't a 90s WWE match involving The Undertaker and Kane. Instead, it was an actual medieval execution method designed to be as grim as possible for those who deserve the worst type of death imaginable. So if you've been condemned to death for a major crime, such as when you were a nun who broke your vow, or if you were an adulterer, you're not going to get a quick beheading or hanging. Instead, the authorities are going to make you suffer. What happens is that you'll be placed in a tight coffin with just enough room to fit your body and a small pocket of air. From there, you'll be buried 6 feet under, or in an underground cavern with nothing but pitch black darkness. The goal here is to kill you slowly and terrifyingly, as there is nothing you can do but scream your lungs out, hoping that anyone will hear and rescue you. But that only speeds up your death, because screaming will only consume whatever oxygen is left inside the casket. Claustrophobia will also kick in to terrorize you mentally and emotionally. Meanwhile, the lack of air and the crushing weight of the earth above you will suffocate you slowly but surely, and you're only going to lose your mind to the horror of your impending death. The Colombian necktie. The Colombian necktie wasn't a medieval fashion statement or a trendy accessory. Instead, it was an unusually dark and savage execution method that was made famous in Colombia from the latter part of the medieval period until the modern era. Like most execution methods, this was a public affair where you'd be taken to a scaffold in front of everyone in town. From there, an executioner would use a sharp blade to skillfully slit your neck open from ear to ear, allowing blood to stain the stage or even splatter to the crowd in front. In most cases, the execution stops there, as the authorities would say, "Yep, that's more than enough to kill the guy." However, the Colombian necktie takes things to a gruesome level, with the executioner reaching into the wound to grasp your tongue. He then pulls it out through the slash in your throat and then allows it to hang around your neck, resembling a necktie. Now you know where the name comes from. As you can see, it's a throat slit that has a darker extra step meant to humiliate you and strike horror into the hearts of the crowd. Of course, the more sadistic townspeople would probably be cheering on, because we all know that some medieval folks weren't the most civilized people. The Tiber. It's the Middle Ages, and you're in Rome, but instead of enjoying the sights and sounds of this ancient city while basking in the scenery of the Tiber River, you're there to be executed in a manner exclusive to the Romans. The Tiber River used to be a stage for executions during the medieval era, and it was one of the most dramatic ways of killing a condemned criminal while making a statement to the people. In most cases, criminals and rebels deserving the harshest execution were made to face the Tiber. You'd be taken to the edge of the river, usually a bridge that spans the entire Tiber River. Locals and travelers alike would go there to witness justice served the Roman way, as you're paraded through the streets to humiliate you and warn other people never to do what you did when you got convicted of a crime. Once you reach the riverbank, you will face your final moments. The executioners would have a lot of different ways to end you. They could simply throw you off the bridge to let you drown in the waters of the river, but there was a more inhumane way of killing you. They could tie you to a stake and leave you near the riverbank during a low tide. From there, you'd be left to die as the river's currents rise, eventually drowning you slowly and steadily. So if you happen to be in Rome in today's era, you'd probably be thinking about how many people met their end by drowning in this now famous tourist site. Mazzatello. You may know Italy as the land where people get offended if you don't eat your pizza the right way or use heavy cream on your carbonara. But there was a darker period in this country's time when offending the law meant getting executed through a method called mazzatello. Don't mistake this for mozzarella's cousin, because mazzatello is entirely different. The name originates from the Italian word mazza, meaning mace. Now, you probably already know where this is going. If you were the condemned, you'd be taken to a scaffold, where a priest would offer last rites. But what seemed like a solemn affair immediately turns into a bloody event when the executioner arrives with a large mallet-like weapon. From there, the executioner would deliver a fatal blow to your head, crushing your skull. But if you have a particularly thick head that's capable of taking the initial mallet blow, you're not in the clear just yet. You'd probably even wish that you died right then and there, because the second stage is even worse. The executioner, instead of delivering a second mallet blow, would cut your throat, ensuring your death. In short, this was a two-step process that was so brutal that it wasn't the most precise way of killing people, because they couldn't find a better way to kill you instantly. Then again, the fact that it was barbaric and primitive was one of the reasons why it also served as a reminder to people never to break Italian law. Inca Capacocha rituals. The Incans were known for the Capacocha rituals, which were meant to make the gods happy and bring balance and prosperity to their empire. During these rituals, the Incans purposefully chose the most beautiful out of all of the children in the city. Children of both genders needed to be selected. Local communities from the empire needed to supply these children yearly, and no community was exempted from this rule. The males should not be older than 10, while the girls could be as old as 16. For many families, it was an honor for their children to be selected because it meant getting chummy with the emperor. Hey, emperor, we gave you our child, so why not give us more land in exchange? The kids would then be taken to Cusco, the capital city of the Inca Empire, where they would be treated like kings and queens for a year. They made these children eat the best foods, while teaching them important life skills. Unlike some of their ancient neighbors, these kids were not meant to be food for the gods. Instead, they were meant to be messengers between the Incas and their deities. That's why these kids needed to be treated like royalty before they would be sacrificed. A year later, the chosen children would be dressed in the best clothes and led to a mountain or lake. These kids were made to drink substances that forced them to sleep so that their deaths would be peaceful. If the site of the sacrifice was cold, they'd leave the child to die from hypothermia. In all other cases, they'd kill the children using a swift blow to the head. After that, the Incas expected the souls of these kids to travel to the place of the gods. Aztec human sacrifices. You think that life was simple for you and your friends living in the Aztec civilization hundreds of years in what is now Mexico, but your tribe's chief suddenly asks if anyone was willing enough to sacrifice themselves to the gods. That was when everyone around you started pointing fingers, because no one wanted to be the next guy to be sacrificed to the gods. Aztec priests would conduct ceremonies before removing the victim's heart while the victim was still alive, ensuring that the heart was still beating. They would offer the heart to the gods before throwing the lifeless body down the temple steps. The practice is deeply rooted in their lore, which says that the Aztec gods had sacrificed themselves to create and sustain the world, so they had to sacrifice people to the gods. The sun god Huitzilopochtli, for example, was thought to use human hearts to make the sun rise every day, so they believed human sacrifices were necessary to continue the cycle of nature and the cosmos. Okay, gods, here is your human sacrifice. Thank you, and please continue doing your job. While the Aztecs still sacrificed their own people in rare instances, they usually sacrificed war captives and slaves. Even if they needed to sacrifice one of their own, they saw it as their duty to their people. So yeah, it wasn't too bad to get sacrificed after all. Chinese Lingqi. The Chinese were known for inventing many creative things, including certain methods of killing people in public rituals. One such method that existed until the early 1900s is called Lingqi, which literally means death by 1,000 cuts. If you were a criminal who deserved the worst punishments in China, they wouldn't kill you quickly. Instead, they had to give you the slowest and most painful death possible in front of a live audience. You'd get tied up in public, such as a town square. From there, the executioner would get a big knife and cut small pieces of flesh slowly. Then they'd put salt in all of those tiny little wounds all over your body to make them hurt even more. And every few hours, they'd wash your wounds with cold water to clean them and repeat the entire process, making it even more brutal. Lingqi was meant to make you suffer instead of killing you quickly. They'd start by cutting your chest, arms, and legs, while avoiding vital organs to make the ritualistic killing last as long as possible. While that happens, Chinese officials read the charges against you to ensure that everyone in attendance knows the consequences of breaking the law. After that, if you haven't bled to death yet, the executioner would deliver a final blow to the heart or strangle you in an act of mercy. Lingqi wasn't just made to kill you, instead it was also meant to humiliate you in front of a lot of people. Lingqi was used for hundreds of years all over China. The last time a person was killed using this method was in 1905. Since then, it has been outlawed for being a bit too brutal. Celtic Wicker Man. You probably know the people of Ireland for their incredible drinking habits, but you probably didn't know that these people were supposedly into giant human-shaped structures made out of wood. But these wooden dolls were made for a sinister purpose. Celtic priests, called druids, were known to be close to nature and the gods. According to ancient Roman writings, especially those by Julius Caesar, who often described the Celts as barbaric people, these druids ordered the construction of these wicker men to honor their deities. They stuffed the wicker men with live humans or animals and set them on fire to offer them to the divine to ensure good harvests and victories in war. Caesar said that they prioritized criminals as they preferred victims. However, if there were no criminals, they were willing to burn innocent people alive. So if you lived with the Celts back then, you'd wish that they had a few criminals in stock for these sacrifices. Honoring their gods was one thing, but there was another rumored reason why the Celts burned people. According to Greek geographer Strabo, the ashes of people burned in the Wicker Man were said to help crops grow. Only years later, they figured out that poop can be just as good fertilizer for their crop, even better than the ashes from an innocent burned human, so they stopped doing this practice. Thuggee cult in India. While ancient cultures did most ritualistic killings, the Thuggee cult in India said during the 1800s, "Hey, let's make ritualistic killings cool again." The Thuggees, however, operated in the shadows during the 19th century. This cult was made up of criminals who worshipped the Hindu goddess Kali, but they took their worship to a dark level by using murder as a way to prove their devotion to her. These criminals targeted unsuspecting travelers. They lured them with their friendship before killing them once they dropped their guard. But the Thuggees didn't use just any ordinary method of killing. Instead, they preferred strangulation with a handkerchief or noose because they believed that this was what Kali wanted. But the Thuggees were not just random criminals. Instead, this cult had an organized way of doing things, often raising young Thuggees from childhood to train them in the art of deception and murder. They often operated in groups that had members with specific roles to play. One guy scouted the victims, while the other guy specialized in befriending them. The most skilled person in the group took care of the killing. Finally, one member was responsible for disposing of the body. So if you were a random traveler in India during the 19th century, you were never told to befriend strangers, because these people could be Thuggees hiding under the guise of being friendly locals. Viking Blood Eagle. When you think about the Vikings, you'd surely imagine large bearded men landing from their longboats to ransack villages while chopping people left and right with huge axes. But as brutal as Vikings were, they still had limits, especially regarding their laws. It was okay for them to pillage entire villages, kill innocent villagers, and women. However, if you betrayed your fellow Vikings, then you deserve to die in the worst way possible in a ritual killing known as the Blood Eagle. What happens is that they'd lay you on your belly, cut your back open, and pull your ribs out through the cut. After that, your lungs were pulled through the opening to create a pair of wings. Now you know why it's called the Blood Eagle. You'd look like a winged warrior with lungs dripping with blood. But to make matters worse, they'd pour salt in the wounds to make you suffer while bleeding. However, there was never any real evidence that the Vikings actually did this. Only 2 accounts mention the Blood Eagle being used to kill someone. Some historians argue that the Viking Blood Eagle was just a horror story told by the Norse people to keep them in line. It could have been a horror story that Viking wives told their children to make sure that they'd never do bad things, just like how our parents tell us about the boogeyman. Whatever the case, no one wants to die with their lungs jutting out of their back. Vestal Virgin's Burial. Being a Vestal Virgin, a priestess worshipping the goddess Vesta, would have been the best gig for you if you lived as a woman in ancient Rome. These women had plenty of privileges. For example, they could go around the city in fancy chariots or could pardon criminals. But being a Vestal Virgin came with a catch, and there's a good reason why they were called virgins. You had to be celibate for 30 years, which means that no sex for you for 3 decades. No dates with those armored and muscle-bound Praetorian guards for you. If you broke your vow by doing the deed with someone and losing your virginity, you'll be punished in the worst way possible. Vestal virgins who lost their virginity within their 30-year vow deserved death. But the problem was that, according to their laws, the Romans couldn't spill the blood of a Vestal virgin. As such, the only way to kill them was to bury them alive. Technically, however, it was also forbidden to have burials inside a Roman city, so the solution was actually simple. The Romans would keep the Vestal virgins locked inside a room, letting them die of thirst and hunger. So while it was called a burial, it wasn't necessarily a burial at all. We on this channel also provide special privileges to anyone willing enough, regardless of whether or not you're a virgin. You just have to join our Discord. Japanese seppuku. The Japanese samurai valued honor above everything else, so much so that they'd be willing to kill themselves if they lost their honor or if they insulted the honor of their lord. This Japanese ritual suicide was called seppuku, which was the final act a samurai could commit so that they could die with their honor intact. If you were a samurai who, let's say, accidentally told your shogun that he was ugly while you were drunk, you would either voluntarily commit seppuku or wait for your lord to tell you to do it. During the ritual, you must wear white robes to symbolize purity. From there, you write a death poem before grabbing a short blade. You'd have to stab your belly with the small blade while making a left to right cut. This is meant to demonstrate your resolve, as you're supposed to be able to still cut yourself despite feeling all the pain in the world after stabbing yourself. But it's not the disembowelment that kills you. Instead, a samurai called a second will stand beside you with a sharp katana in hand. The second will be responsible for beheading you with one quick slash after you've made the initial cut on your belly. Seppuku isn't just about dying for the sake of dying, it's about dying with honor, and that's why only those worthy of an honorable death were allowed to commit seppuku. But the Japanese don't practice this anymore, or else we'd be seeing dozens of Japanese students committing seppuku for bringing dishonor to the family after not getting an A in math. Scythian human sacrifices. More than 1,000 years ago, the Scythians were the OG hippies. They lived nomadic lifestyles in the Eurasian steppes. These people were deeply spiritual and believed in the afterlife. So whenever someone important died, they wouldn't send them off on their own. These send-off parties or rituals usually involved some of the most important things to the significant Scythian person who had just died. In most cases, this happens whenever their leaders or chiefs die. They'd bundle horses, servants, or even the best friends of these Scythian leaders and bury them alive in a big pit together with their deceased buddy. In fact, archaeologists have found ancient Scythian burial mounds with entire people and horses bundled together. They did this because they wanted people close to their leaders to accompany them in the afterlife. The Scythians believed that their leaders needed a gang in the great beyond. The more important the do, the more people would be buried together with him. So if you were a Scythian during ancient times, it's best not to be drinking buddies with the most important guy in the group, because this will be a sure ticket to death. Hawaiian human sacrifices. Hawaii may seem like the best tropical island destination for you. Still, there was a time when this paradise on Earth wasn't exactly all about basking under the sun and drinking pina coladas while watching people surfing. During the darker times in Hawaiian culture, the ancient Hawaiians often endured extreme famine. In some cases, they were at war with other tribes. Such instances required them to go through extreme measures by sacrificing people to make the gods happy and to protect the people. Usually, a high priest or chief would select the best person to be sacrificed based on a certain criterion. They would often choose a person from a defeated tribe, especially if they want to win another war. But if there were someone expendable in their tribe, such as the person who often sucked at fighting or didn't have any talents, he would be sacrificed for fertile harvests. However, if you were a tribesman chosen to be sacrificed, it's not all about being gloomy for you, because it was your solemn duty to die to protect your people. That's why the chosen sacrifice was treated with reverence and respect. After being prepared for the ritual, the chosen person would have to lie face down on a stone altar where a priest would kill him swiftly using a sharp blade. From there, the body would be offered as a gift to the gods, as the Hawaiians believed that the mana, the person's life force, would help strengthen the tribe and bring fertility to the community. Mayan heart extraction. You probably know the Mayans for scaring the shit out of everyone when, in 2012, their calendar predicted the end of the world that year. But you've also probably heard that these guys were known for their bloody religious rituals. These guys believed their gods needed nourishment to keep the world running smoothly. But because they thought the gods were bloodthirsty deities, the Mayans also believed that offering human hearts was the only way to prevent them from getting angry and hungry. After all, even the gods need something to eat to use their powers. Ceremonies involving prisoners or slaves were done at the top of Mayan pyramids. It started with a dispersal of blood extracted from the victim's mouth or penis. Yeah, not only would you be sacrificed for the gods, but you should also say goodbye to your manhood before you get killed. The human sacrifice would be laid on a stone altar before a priest would use a blade to make a quick cut on the chest, making sure that the victim was still alive. The heart needed to be extracted while it was still beating, and that was why these priests were trained to know how to extract a heart without killing the human sacrifice. After the heart is extracted, the priest would lift it up into the sky, offering it to the gods. This act was the Mayans' way of keeping their gods happy, because they needed human hearts to nourish their powers, ensuring the world wouldn't end just yet. So maybe it's possible that the world didn't end in 2012 because someone sacrificed a human heart. Who knows?